Some people think the smallest decisions disappear into the noise of an ordinary day. But sometimes a single choice becomes the moment an entire city remembers forever. The Saturday morning air in downtown Oakwood carried the familiar rhythm of weekend life as families wandered between local shops, cyclists rolled past coffee houses, and children laughed while chasing pigeons across the brick plaza. Nothing about the bright spring sky suggested that the next few minutes would become the center of thousands of conversations before the sun ever set. 17-year-old Ava Johnson adjusted the strap of her backpack as she walked toward the neighborhood bookstore where she worked every weekend. She had left home 20 minutes early, just as she always did, because being late simply wasn't part of who she was. Her mother often told her that character was measured by the little promises people kept when nobody was watching, and Ava had carried those words with her since childhood. She smiled politely as she passed an elderly couple struggling with shopping bags and stopped long enough to hold the glass door of a bakery open for them before continuing down Maple Avenue. She never imagined that kindness and calm would soon be tested in ways she had never experienced before. Parked along the curb sat a black and white police cruiser with its engine quietly humming beneath the morning sun. Officer Ethan Brooks leaned against the driver's door, scanning the sidewalks with the confidence of someone who believed every street belonged to him the moment he stepped onto it. He had worn the badge for more than a decade, and many people recognized him immediately. Some greeted him with respect. Others simply lowered their eyes and kept walking. Ava noticed the cruiser, but paid little attention. She had no reason to. She stayed on the sidewalk, earbuds tucked safely into her pocket instead of her ears because she liked hearing the sounds of the city around her. As she approached the intersection, a sharp voice suddenly cut through the morning chatter. "You, stop right there." Several pedestrians instinctively turned toward the sound before quickly looking away again. Ava slowed, glanced over her shoulder, and realized the officer was looking directly at her. Confusion crossed her face for only a second before she calmly stopped walking. She looked around, almost expecting someone else to step forward, but no one did. The traffic light changed. Cars continued moving. Conversations faded into uneasy silence as curious strangers sensed that something uncomfortable was unfolding. Ava kept both hands visible at her sides and answered with a respectful voice. "Good morning, officer. Is something wrong?" Officer Brooks walked toward her without returning the greeting, his expression unreadable beneath mirrored sunglasses. Around them, phones slowly disappeared from pockets, though no one had yet raised one high enough to record. Most people hoped the encounter would end as quickly as it had begun. They had no idea they were about to witness the first moments of a story that would soon reach far beyond Maple Avenue, because neither Ava nor Officer Brooks realized that before this morning was over, one ordinary street corner would become the place where a single decision changed everything. Officer Brooks stopped only a few feet away, his polished badge catching the morning sunlight, while the quiet sounds of downtown Oakwood seemed to fade into the background. Ava stood exactly where she was, keeping her voice steady and respectful even as she noticed more people slowing their pace along the sidewalk. Nobody understood why the officer had singled her out, and the uncertainty settled over the intersection like a heavy cloud. "May I see some identification?" he asked. Ava nodded politely and answered, "Of course, officer. My wallet is in my backpack. Is it all right if I reach for it?" Her question was simple, careful, and calm, the kind of answer every parent hopes their child remembers during an unexpected encounter. Officer Brooks gave a short nod without softening his expression. Ava slowly removed her wallet and handed over her identification card. He looked at it only briefly before his eyes returned to her face. Instead of explaining why she had been stopped, he began asking questions that seemed disconnected from anything she had done. "Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Why are you in this neighborhood?" Ava answered each one honestly. She explained that she lived only a few miles away, worked weekends at the bookstore around the corner, and had left home early as she always did. Her voice never rose. Her posture never changed. Yet the officer appeared unconvinced, as though he had already decided what he wanted to believe before asking the first question. A few shoppers exchanged uncertain glances. An elderly man quietly shook his head before continuing down the street, while a young woman standing outside the bakery slowly unlocked her phone without saying a word. Something about the conversation no longer felt routine. It felt personal. Officer Brooks took another step closer and instructed Ava to remain exactly where she was. She calmly replied that she had no intention of leaving and simply wanted to understand why she had been stopped. The question lingered in the air unanswered. The silence became more uncomfortable than any raised voice could have been. A city bus rolled past the intersection, its windows reflecting the growing crowd of curious faces. More people had begun watching than either of them realized. Some whispered quietly to one another. Others simply observed, hoping the misunderstanding would end peacefully. Ava drew a slow breath, remembering her mother's advice that dignity was something no one could take away unless you surrendered it yourself. She focused on staying composed, refusing to match tension with tension. Officer Brooks interpreted her calmness differently. Rather than seeing respect, he appeared to mistake it for defiance. His words became sharper, and the atmosphere shifted once again. The woman outside the bakery discreetly started recording from across the sidewalk, followed moments later by another passerby near the crosswalk. Neither of them expected history. They simply felt that the moment deserved an accurate record. Ava remained where she was, her eyes steady and her hands visible, surrounded by strangers who had become silent witnesses without ever intending to be. Across the street, the bookstore manager stepped outside. After noticing the unusual crowd gathering near the corner, he looked toward Ava with growing concern, recognizing one of his most dependable employees standing alone in the middle of an encounter that no longer seemed ordinary. At that very moment, none of the people watching could have known that the quiet recordings beginning on two ordinary cell phones would soon become impossible for anyone in Oakwood to ignore. The crowd remained unusually quiet even after several people resumed walking, because the feeling that something important had just happened refused to disappear. Ava stood with remarkable composure, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket before calmly collecting her backpack from a sidewalk. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply thanked the bookstore manager for checking on her and assured him that she was all right. That single response puzzled nearly everyone who had witnessed the encounter. A teenager who had been treated unfairly might have shouted in frustration or broken down in tears, yet Ava chose neither. Her silence was not surrender. It was discipline. It was the quiet confidence of someone who believed that truth did not become stronger by being louder. Officer Brooks returned to his patrol vehicle, convinced that the situation had ended exactly where he expected it would. From his perspective, the sidewalk was already returning to normal, the traffic was moving again, and people would soon forget what they had seen. He had no reason to suspect that several phones had captured nearly every moment from different angles. He drove away believing the story would disappear before lunchtime. Across the street, however, the young woman outside the bakery watched the recording one more time with a troubled expression. She did not edit it. She did not add dramatic music or emotional captions. She simply uploaded the video with a short description asking a straightforward question about whether the encounter had been handled fairly. Within minutes, friends began sharing it, then neighbors, then complete strangers. Meanwhile, Ava quietly arrived at the bookstore, placed her backpack behind the counter, and greeted her coworkers. With the same polite smile she wore every Saturday morning. They immediately noticed something was different. One employee asked if she wanted to take a break before opening the store, but Ava gently declined. She insisted on shelving new arrivals exactly as she always did. Every movement reflected the same calm determination. She refused to allow one difficult morning to define the rest of her day. Around noon, the first customer approached the register holding a novel but paused before paying. "Are you the young woman from the video?" he asked softly. Ava hesitated for only a moment before answering, "Yes." The customer nodded respectfully and replied, "I just wanted you to know that a lot of people are thinking about you today." Those words surprised her more than anything that had happened that morning. She had not looked at her phone once since arriving at work. She had no idea the recording was spreading across Oakwood faster than anyone could have imagined. By early afternoon, local community groups were discussing the footage online. Some viewers debated what they believed had happened before the recording began, while others focused on Ava's calm behavior throughout the encounter. One detail appeared again and again in thousands of comments. People could not understand why she had remained so composed under such intense pressure. They expected anger. They found restraint instead. That unexpected dignity transformed the conversation. It encouraged witnesses who had remained silent to come forward with their own accounts of what they had observed on Maple Avenue. One after another, complete strangers began telling remarkably similar stories. As the number of voices grew, a narrative that Officer Brooks believed had already ended quietly was beginning to take on a life entirely beyond his control, and somewhere inside police headquarters, an unnoticed notification appeared in an inbox that would soon change the direction of the entire investigation. By the time the afternoon sun settled above Oakwood, the story had traveled far beyond the streets where it began. The recording continued spreading from one phone to another, not because it contained loud arguments or dramatic scenes, but because it captured something people recognized immediately: a young woman remaining calm while questions about fairness continued to grow. News stations had not yet reported the incident, yet community organizations, local business owners, church leaders, and neighborhood groups were already discussing it. Everyone seemed to be asking the same question: what had happened before the cameras started recording, and why had such an ordinary walk to work become the center of so much attention? Inside the bookstore, Ava finished helping a customer find a history book before quietly excusing herself for a short break. She finally looked at her phone. Hundreds of unread messages filled the screen. A friend from school had reached out. Former teachers had sent words of encouragement. Even people she had never met thanked her for remaining composed. Ava slowly sat on a wooden bench behind the store, taking a deep breath before calling her parents. Her mother answered almost immediately, her voice calm despite the obvious concern. "We saw the video," she said gently. "Are you safe?" Ava assured her that she was. She explained every detail as carefully as she could, never exaggerating, never leaving out the moments that mattered. Her father, David Johnson, listened quietly on speakerphone without interrupting once. When she finished, he spoke only a single sentence: "We will let the truth do its work." Those words reflected the values he had taught her throughout her life. They were not interested in revenge. They believed accountability began with facts. Across town, Officer Ethan Brooks walked into the police station expecting an uneventful end to his shift. Instead, several conversations stopped the moment he entered the hallway. A few fellow officers glanced toward him before returning to their desks. Others appeared unusually distracted as computer screens displayed news alerts and social media discussions that continued multiplying by the minute. Captain Marcus Hill stepped out of his office and asked Officer Brooks to join him for a private conversation before completing any additional assignments. The request sounded routine, yet the expression on the captain's face suggested otherwise. Inside the office, Captain Hill placed a tablet on the desk without saying a word. The screen displayed multiple recordings from different angles, each one revealing another piece of the same encounter on Maple Avenue. No dramatic commentary, no edited clips, just ordinary citizens documenting what they had seen. The captain folded his hands and asked a simple question: "Is there anything about this interaction that I need to know before Internal Affairs reviews it?" For the first time that day, Officer Brooks hesitated before answering. Meanwhile, several miles away, more witnesses contacted local officials after recognizing themselves in the background of the recordings. Each statement added another small piece to a growing picture. None of them claimed to know everything, but together they painted a remarkably consistent account. As evening approached, local reporters began requesting official comments from the police department, while civic leaders encouraged patience until the facts could be reviewed. Ava returned to the sales floor and greeted another customer with the same quiet professionalism she had shown all day, completely unaware that somewhere inside City Hall, a formal review was already beginning. And by the following morning, people with far greater authority than anyone on Maple Avenue would be asking questions that could no longer be ignored. Morning arrived with a sense of anticipation that spread through Oakwood long before most businesses opened their doors. The conversations that had begun on neighborhood sidewalks the day before had now reached city offices, local newspapers, and the headquarters of the police department itself. What had started as a brief public encounter was no longer being discussed as an isolated incident. It had become a question of accountability, professionalism, and public trust. Inside police headquarters, Captain Marcus Hill convened an early meeting with representatives from internal affairs. Every available recording was collected, including body camera footage, dashboard camera files, nearby security videos, and statement from witnesses who had voluntarily come forward overnight. The investigators agreed on one principle before reviewing the evidence. They would allow facts, not assumptions, to guide every conclusion. Officer Ethan Brooks sat quietly across the conference table. The confidence he had displayed the previous day was noticeably diminished. He answered each procedural question, but his responses became increasingly cautious as investigators compared his written report with a growing collection of independent recordings. Small details that had seemed unimportant when written separately suddenly mattered when placed side by side. Timelines were measured down to the minute. Distances were confirmed using security cameras from nearby businesses. Witness statements were organized in chronological order. The investigation was becoming remarkably thorough. Across town, Ava Johnson prepared for another day at the bookstore. She had barely slept, yet she refused to let uncertainty dictate her routine. Her mother poured a cup of coffee while her father quietly reviewed the latest public statement released by the police department. It confirmed that an official review had begun and encouraged anyone with relevant information to contact investigators. David Johnson folded the statement and looked toward his daughter with a reassuring smile. "The process has started," he said. "Now we allow integrity to do its work." Ava nodded without saying much. She understood that public attention could disappear as quickly as it appeared, but she also believed that honesty remained valuable whether cameras were present or not. Throughout the morning, more witnesses contacted internal affairs. Among them was the bookstore manager, who described Ava's character with careful precision. A retired school principal who had watched part of the encounter from across the street also submitted a statement, emphasizing how respectful Ava had remained from beginning to end. Even the bakery employee who had first uploaded the recording met with investigators and provided the original unedited file directly from her phone. Each contribution strengthened the accuracy of the timeline. None of the witnesses appeared interested in creating drama. They simply wanted the complete story to be understood. By early afternoon, local reporters gathered outside police headquarters, waiting for any indication of what would happen next. Captain Hill declined to discuss details, but confirmed that the review would continue until every relevant fact had been examined. Inside the building, investigators quietly noticed another important detail. The body camera recording, combined with multiple public videos, provided overlapping perspectives that left very little room for uncertainty about the sequence of events. One investigator leaned back in his chair after reviewing the synchronized footage and quietly remarked that public confidence depended not only on how officers served the community, but also on how departments responded when difficult questions arose. At nearly the same moment, a message arrived from the office of Judge Eleanor Carter requesting updates on the review, because formal legal proceedings could soon require the complete investigative record. And with that single notification, everyone involved realized that the search for truth was about to move beyond public opinion and into a place where every word and every fact would carry lasting weight. The hearing began on a gray Tuesday morning beneath the tall stone columns of the Oakwood Justice Center, where reporters, community leaders, and ordinary residents gathered long before the doors opened. Nobody came expecting dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. They came because they believed that when public trust is questioned, the truth deserves to be heard in the open. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Judge Eleanor Carter entered with the calm confidence of someone who understood that fairness depended not on public opinion, but on careful examination of facts. Her steady voice reminded everyone that the proceeding would focus on evidence, sworn testimony, and the responsibilities carried by those entrusted with public authority. Ava Johnson quietly took her place beside her family's attorney. She wore the same simple professionalism she had shown from the very beginning, greeting court staff politely and thanking the bailiff who directed her to her seat. Across the room, Officer Ethan Brooks appeared far different from the confident figure who had stood on Maple Avenue only days earlier. His uniform remained neatly pressed, but the certainty that once surrounded him had been replaced by visible tension. Captain Marcus Hill sat several rows behind him, observing in complete silence. The hearing opened with the presentation of the investigative timeline assembled by Internal Affairs. Rather than relying on a single perspective, investigators displayed synchronized recordings from multiple public cameras, nearby businesses, and official department equipment. Every timestamp aligned with remarkable precision. Witness statements were introduced one after another, each reinforcing the same sequence of events without unnecessary exaggeration. The consistency of the evidence became impossible to ignore. The courtroom remained almost perfectly silent as each piece fit naturally into the next. When Officer Brooks was invited to explain portions of his written report, the questions remained respectful but increasingly specific. Investigators asked why certain observations had appeared in his report despite not being supported by the available recordings. They requested clarification regarding several decisions made during the encounter. At first, he answered with confidence, but as additional footage appeared on the courtroom screens, his responses became noticeably shorter. Facts that had once seemed isolated now stood together in complete context. Every answer was measured against independently verified evidence rather than personal interpretation. Judge Carter listened carefully without interruption, occasionally making notes before inviting the next witness. The atmosphere inside the courtroom never became loud. Instead, it grew steadily heavier as clarity replaced uncertainty. Ava watched quietly, showing neither satisfaction nor resentment. She understood that the purpose of the hearing was not to embarrass anyone, but to determine whether professional standards had been upheld. Her composure drew quiet respect from people throughout the courtroom. Several observers later admitted that her calm presence spoke more powerfully than any emotional statement could have. During a brief recess, reporters outside the courthouse began updating their audiences that the proceeding was unfolding with careful attention to documented facts rather than speculation. Community members waiting outside exchanged hopeful conversations, recognizing that accountability required patience as much as conviction. When the hearing resumed, Judge Carter announced that one final witness would be heard before preliminary findings could be considered. As Ava slowly rose from her seat and walked toward the witness stand, the room grew completely still. Every conversation ended. Every notebook stopped moving. Even Officer Brooks lifted his eyes for the first time in several minutes, because everyone present understood that the next voice they would hear belonged to the person whose quiet dignity had transformed one ordinary morning into a moment the entire city would remember. As Ava Johnson took the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to settle into complete silence. The sound of chairs shifting disappeared. Reporters lowered their pens for a brief moment, and even the photographers waiting outside the courtroom doors stopped speaking as word spread that her testimony was about to begin. Judge Eleanor Carter welcomed her with a calm nod and reminded her to speak clearly and honestly. Ava thanked the judge, took a slow breath, and looked across the room without anger or resentment. Her voice was steady from the very first sentence. She explained that she had left home early because she valued punctuality and responsibility, the same habits her parents had taught her since childhood. She described her walk through downtown Oakwood, the familiar stores, the bakery on the corner, and the quiet expectation of another ordinary workday. Then she carefully recounted the encounter exactly as she remembered it, avoiding dramatic language and refusing to speculate about anyone else's intentions. Every answer she gave remained focused on facts rather than emotion. When asked why she had remained calm throughout the encounter, Ava paused for only a moment before answering, with words that immediately captured the attention of everyone in the courtroom. My parents taught me that another person's choices should never decide my character. I could only control my own actions. A quiet stillness settled over the room. Several jurists exchanged thoughtful glances, while members of the public listened with complete attention. Ava continued by explaining that respect for the law had always been part of her upbringing, and that she believed accountability protected both citizens and honorable officers alike. She said that her hope had never been to embarrass anyone or create division. She simply wanted every person to be treated with fairness, dignity, and equal respect. Her attorney then asked whether she had expected the recordings to spread across the city. Ava gently shook her head. She admitted that she had not even looked at her phone until several hours later, because her priority had been fulfilling her responsibilities at work. She explained that the unexpected attention had been overwhelming, but also reminded her that many strangers still believed kindness and integrity mattered. Judge Carter listened closely before asking one final question of her own. "What outcome are you hoping this court will achieve?" Ava answered without hesitation. "I hope people leave here believing that trust can be rebuilt when truth is respected. I hope young people will never feel that remaining calm and respectful is meaningless. And I hope good officers will know that accountability protects their honor as much as it protects the public." Those words echoed through the courtroom long after she finished speaking. No applause followed because the courtroom demanded order, yet the silence carried its own unmistakable weight. Captain Marcus Hill lowered his eyes for a brief moment, reflecting on the responsibility carried by every badge in his department. Officer Ethan Brooks remained motionless, listening to the testimony without interruption. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, the discussion no longer centered on recordings, reports, or timelines. It centered on principles. Outside the courthouse, reporters preparing their evening. Broadcasts quietly revised their notes, recognizing that the most powerful moment of the hearing had not come from a dramatic confrontation, but from a young woman whose calm honesty reminded an entire community what justice was truly meant to protect. And as Judge Carter announced that the court would recess briefly before delivering preliminary findings, everyone understood that the decision about to follow would reach far beyond the walls of a single courtroom. When the courtroom reconvened, every person returned to their seat with the quiet awareness that the next few minutes would shape far more than a single case. Judge Eleanor Carter reviewed her notes one final time before looking across the room with calm determination. She reminded everyone that the strength of any justice system depended on facts, integrity, and the willingness to hold every public servant to the same professional standards expected of every citizen. The findings she summarized were measured, precise, and grounded entirely in the evidence presented throughout the hearing. The synchronized recordings, witness statements, official reports, and documented timeline all pointed toward the same conclusion. Serious concerns regarding professional judgment and departmental policy required immediate action. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Carter stated that the matter would proceed through the appropriate legal and administrative channels, while recommending that the department implement corrective measures without delay. Captain Marcus Hill slowly stood and acknowledged the court's findings. Speaking on behalf of the Oakwood Police Department, he addressed the room with visible sincerity. He recognized that public trust was not maintained by avoiding difficult conversations, but by confronting them honestly whenever they arose. He confirmed that Officer Ethan Brooks had been relieved of active duty pending the completion of all required procedures, and that the department would begin a comprehensive review of training, supervision, and community engagement practices. His statement was not greeted with celebration. Instead, it was met with thoughtful silence because everyone understood that meaningful accountability carried responsibilities for institutions as well as individuals. Officer Brooks remained seated, listening as each decision unfolded. The confidence that had once defined his presence had given way to quiet reflection. He looked toward the floor for several long moments before finally raising his eyes toward the judge. No dramatic exchange followed. No emotional confrontation interrupted the proceedings. The reality before him spoke more clearly than any argument could have. Choices made in only a few minutes had altered the course of his career and placed the reputation of an entire department under public examination. Across the courtroom, Ava remained composed. She did not react with triumph or satisfaction. She simply listened, grateful that the process had focused on evidence rather than anger. Her parents exchanged a brief glance filled with quiet relief. They had raised their daughter to believe that character revealed itself most clearly during moments of hardship, and watching her remain faithful to those values meant more to them than any headline ever could. Outside the courthouse, reporters delivered updates describing the hearing as a turning point for Oakwood. Community members gathered nearby spoke not about punishment, but about rebuilding confidence between neighbors and those sworn to protect them. Local civic organizations announced plans to host public forums where residents and law enforcement could meet face-to-face, encouraging honest conversations instead of growing division. Even people who had initially disagreed about the incident found themselves agreeing on one principle: transparency strengthened communities. As the courthouse steps slowly emptied beneath the fading afternoon sunlight, Ava paused before walking toward her family. She looked back only once at the building behind her, not because she wished to remember the difficult days that had brought her there, but because she understood that genuine justice was never measured by humiliation or revenge. It was measured by whether truth had been given the opportunity to stand in the light. And although one chapter had now reached its conclusion, the impact of that truth was only beginning to reshape the future of Oakwood. Several weeks later, downtown Oakwood looked much the same as it always had. The bakery welcomed its first customers before sunrise. The bookstore opened its doors with fresh displays in the front window, and families once again filled the sidewalks on Saturday mornings. At first glance, it seemed as though life had quietly returned to normal. Yet anyone who had lived through those remarkable days understood that something important had changed beneath the familiar routine. Trust, once shaken, had begun to rebuild through transparency, patience, and a willingness to learn from difficult moments rather than ignore them. Inside the police department, Captain Marcus Hill introduced new training programs focused on communication, impartial decision-making, and respectful engagement with every member of the community. Officers participated in neighborhood meetings where residents were encouraged to ask honest questions and share honest concerns. Those conversations were not always easy, but they marked the beginning of a stronger relationship built on listening instead of assumptions. Many officers welcomed the opportunity because they understood that the badge represented responsibility before authority. Ava Johnson returned to the life she had always planned to live. She continued working weekends at the bookstore, graduated with honors from high school, and accepted admission to a respected university where she intended to study public policy and constitutional law. Friends often asked whether she regretted remaining so calm throughout the experience. She always answered with the same quiet smile. She explained that dignity was never weakness and that self-respect became most meaningful when tested by adversity. Her words inspired classmates, teachers, and even complete strangers who had followed the story from across the country. Schools invited her to speak about resilience, responsibility, and the importance of believing in lawful accountability. She never described herself as extraordinary. She simply encouraged young people to remember that honesty and composure could influence the future in ways impossible to predict in the present. David and his wife watched their daughter with quiet pride, grateful not because public attention had found her, but because her character had remained unchanged after it did. They often reminded friends that values practiced inside a family home could one day shape an entire community. Meanwhile, Oakwood slowly became known for something unexpected. The city was no longer remembered only for one painful incident. It became recognized for the way citizens, public servants, and local leaders chose to respond together. The recordings that once spread across countless phones eventually became educational material during community discussions about ethics, fairness, and professional responsibility. They served as reminders that accountability was not designed to weaken public institutions, but to strengthen them through honesty. Years later, visitors walking along Maple Avenue would never know why one ordinary street corner carried such meaning for longtime residents. There was no monument, no plaque, and no grand ceremony. Only the quiet memory that on one ordinary morning, a young woman chose dignity over bitterness. A community chose truth over rumor, and a justice system demonstrated that evidence mattered more than influence. Sometimes people imagine that history is written only by famous leaders or extraordinary events. But Oakwood learned that lasting change can begin with one calm voice refusing to surrender its principles. A badge can symbolize authority, but authority earns lasting respect only when guided by integrity. The loudest moment may capture attention, yet it is quiet character that changes hearts. In the end, people did not remember who spoke the harshest words. They remembered who stood with grace when it mattered most. Because truth does not need to shout to be heard, and justice leaves its deepest echo in those who choose character when no easier path remains.